special session in Global Health Cause Shift Happens series, Understanding Climate Justice. I am Anita Namuyaba, GHC's Community Impact Manager for East Africa, and I'm excited for today's discussion with our exceptional panelists and moderator. Many of us understand climate change as an environmental issue. However, this perception is changing due to the indisputable evidence of climate change having a moral, ethical, social, political, and economic effect on communities and countries. Our panelists today each bring with them a wealth of professional experience in climate finance, climate change as it relates to gender, and climate research on the global commons in a changing climate. I'm therefore so grateful to each of them for taking the time to be with us today and to share on this topic. I am also thankful to each of you for joining this conversation. It's my honor to introduce our moderator today, Shaban Senyange. Shaban is a GHC alum from the 2016-2017 Uganda class. He's a self-proclaimed #nature boy, an award-winning wildlife health and conservation media specialist from Uganda. He has spared his dedication to wildlife conservation and passion for media to create the TV show Ecozone, which seeks to generate awareness about wildlife conservation through travel and to advocate for communities affected by tourism. The show also profiles individuals and organizations creating solutions to addressing environmental challenges in Uganda. Shaban is also a contributor to Sides of Horn, the first film to tell the story of Africa's poaching war from both sides of the fence, and has been named among the top 100 young conservation leaders in Africa. Shaban has previously worked with several organizations at the forefront of biodiversity and environmental conservation, public health, and community development in Uganda and beyond. He currently works on several campaigns, including Hike for Maternal Life, an initiative that uses community tourism to raise funds to support efforts to end maternal and infant mortality in Uganda. He also works on the Greening Schools campaign, of which is an ambassador, that works with schools to restore forest cover in Uganda. Shaban will be introducing our panelists for today's discussion about the social, moral, ethical, and economic effects of climate change and how these effects disproportionately affect vulnerable groups, and the measures that should be taken for more inclusive and just climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. I hope everyone on the line will also share your insights, comments, and questions in the chat box and Q&A box. We hope to get as many of them as possible. Shaban, Tara, Sophie, and Reuben, thank you again for joining us. Shaban, I will pass it to you to introduce yourself and our panelists today. Over to you, Shaban.
Thank you so much, Anita. I am excited to be here. I think I don't need to introduce myself further. I think Anita did a brilliant job with that one. Like she said, my name is Shaban Senyange from Kampala, Uganda, but you can call me Nature Boy because we are going to be talking about climate change. And I am privileged and honored to be here. And I'm joined by amazing panelists who are going to be breaking it down for us. But before we get started, I just wanted to ask a food for thought, if you may. Now, if you are asked to paint a picture of what climate change looks like in your own community, what would that picture look like? I want us all to take a moment, a second, to think about what climate change means in our own communities and have the picture in your mind. Maybe at a later time in the chat room, we can sample out what those pictures look like for people in their different communities. So let's take a moment and think about that. All right, looking forward to hearing what those pictures look like. And as we continue to visualize what those pictures look like, let's get those pictures and translate them to what today's topic is going to be focusing on. We're going to be understanding climate justice. And I am joined by three amazing panelists. And we have Reuben Wambui, who is the Africa Regional Lead for the United Nations Environment Program, the Financial Initiative. We have Sophia Boehm, I hope I got the name right, the pronunciation. She's a research associate with Climate World Resource Institute. And we have Tara Daniel, who is the senior program manager for Women's Environment and Development Organization. Now, the panelists are going to be introducing themselves and more about their work, but more importantly, how their work links to climate change and climate justice. So we're going to kick it off with Tara. So Tara, if you could introduce yourself, what you do, and how your work links to today's discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shaban. So I work with the Women's Environment and Development Organization, or we do. And there I lead our portfolio of work on what we call feminist climate finance. I also support women's participation and leadership in the climate negotiations, and I advocate for gender responsive climate policies, particularly working with the Women and Gender Constituency, which is an observer constituency following the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. I draw from my interdisciplinary background, including dual master's degrees in sustainable development and conservation biology and public policy from the University of Maryland, for my feminist analysis and advocacy. And I'm incredibly grateful because so much of my work involves working in coalition and in network spaces where we're bringing together feminists from the global north and the global south to talk about what truly climate just, gender just solutions to the climate crisis should look like. And so I am looking forward to having this discussion with everyone today.
Thank you so much, Tara. Now, from what you've mentioned a very, very key issue which relates to gender and climate change. I think we're living in a world where women are beginning to realize and recognize how much impact they can have in some of these global discussions. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your work and how you've seen change in the past couple of years and where we're headed when we go into our climate change and gender session later. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. Now, Sophie, you are working with the World Resource Institute on their research. If you could please tell us more about yourself and more about that work and how that links to climate change and justice. So, Sophie?
Yeah, happy to. And first of all, thanks so much to GHC for organizing this, and Anita, for you specifically for putting this all together. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As Shaban mentioned, I work for World Resources Institute, which is an environmental think tank based in Washington, D.C. I'm a research associate in the climate program, and I work specifically for an initiative called the Systems Change Lab. And what we do is we're focused on kind of translating these really big system-wide changes that the science says needs to happen into a set of concrete, actionable targets for 2030 and 2050 across key systems like power or agriculture or industry. We monitor progress towards those targets to give decision makers a sense of, are we on track? Are we off track? My research also focuses on what are the conditions that can enable change, whether that's finance or supportive policies or technological innovation. And our hope is that we can package all of these insights together to share with decision makers to help inform the policies and actions that they're taking to accelerate these transformations. I focus specifically on our research across agriculture, forestry, and other land use systems. And I think, in the context of this work, there are many different pathways that you can take to address climate change, to hold global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, to build resilience to climate impacts. And some of them are more inclusive and more just than others. And so a big part of my research is thinking about how to integrate those considerations into the targets that we're developing, the conditions that we're focusing on, to ensure that the pathway that's taken towards this more sustainable future is just and is inclusive. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation and to digging in a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Now, you did mention two aspects that have really, sparked a lot of interest from my end. One, research, and then second, communication. Now, there's a lot of research that goes into climate change, not just climate change, but other key aspects of development, especially on the continent. And if you don't break that down to things that are relatable to people, then they're going to sort of take themselves away from the conversation of climate change. They're not going to be able to know what they can do at individual level to create that impact. So whereas research gives us the data to be able to make the decisions, but it also gives us a starting point to have these discussions. And if you break it down to something that is understandable, then it is able to be relatable to the audiences, and they can know climate change doesn't seem like it's for the elites, you know what I mean? And I'm really looking forward to digging into that a little bit more with you later on. Now, over to you, Reuben. I understand that you are leading the United Nations Environment Program's Finance Institute's efforts in Africa. If you could tell us a bit more about that, what you do specifically, and then how that links to climate justice and climate change and today's discussion.
Thanks, Shaban, and thanks to GSC for making this invite. I'll give a short anecdote and then say what I do. I think in that fashion, it's gonna be easier. So in 2018, I attended a conference called Unleash, which brings together young leaders. Unleash brings together like 1,000 young leaders to work on SDG solutions. And I remember Unleash 2018 was in Singapore, and we were there like for 8 days. And we were working on all these cool topics on how to address SDG related issues. So I was working on SDG 2, which was hunger, zero hunger. And we came up with a very cool idea, which was of a homemade refrigerator, which doesn't use electricity, but uses the concept of evaporation and cooling. And there were all these nice prototypes of products everyone made. But I figured there was a gap. No one was talking about where the money is going to come from if we end up coming up with all these cool SDG solutions. And that, in a sense, explains what I do. You've probably heard of UNEP, but within UNEP, we have UNEP Finance Initiative, which is the arm of UNEP that works with the private finance sector. So this being banks, insurers, and investors, and how we can actually mobilize the private finance sector globally to actually allocate capital or steer their investments towards sustainable solutions. So we work with banks and insurers on sustainability products, and also, elements of green finance and sustainable finance. So that is what I do, and I lead the work in Africa. Thank you.
That is absolutely brilliant, Reuben. And I think you really touch on something that is quite important. We have all these amazing projects that we want to launch, and we want to, put in efforts to combat climate change, but everything needs to be financed. So I think you bring such a relevant discussion and, a piece to this bigger puzzle that is really, really pivotal into helping fuel efforts towards combating climate change. Now, today's discussion obviously is going to be focusing on a lot of issues around climate justice. And our first sort of breakdown session is going to be focusing on the foundations and concept of climate justice. And, climate justice basically refers to climate change as a social, moral, ethical, and political issue rather than just a physical and environmental one. And it is part of a technical effort that involves, climate action to cut emissions into an approach that also addresses human rights and social inequality. And I'm very happy that, throughout the work that Reuben, Sophia, and Tara do, aspects of these have really come up. And that's why I'm very, very excited for this discussion. Now, what are some of the poignant social, moral, ethical, and political issues that relate to climate change from your own understanding and from your own experiences, and what you've seen sort of unfold in the recent events that we've seen as a country, as a continent, and as a world when it links to climate change? If Tara is happy to kick us off.
I am happy to kick us off. Thank you so much, Shaban. So climate is a social, moral, ethical, and political issue, but not only because of its consequences, but because of its causes. They're so fundamentally entwined with these inequitable and destructive systems that govern our world, whether we're talking about extractive capitalism and rampant consumerism, settler colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, militarism. We know that addressing climate change requires addressing fundamental justice questions of who is responsible for action, not just in this moment, but also historically, and who bears the consequences, who gets to make decisions and who truly has the power in making decisions about policies, about which solutions are being prioritized moving forward, and how we redesign our societies to consume resources. Climate change brings up these questions of what kind of world we want to live in, not only in terms of biodiversity and healthy ecosystems, but also in terms of human rights, thinking about not only how human rights can be protected and promoted in a changing world, but also how their promotion can serve as an adaptation strategy, a really key adaptation strategy. So we think about climate change in this way, with this kind of problem identification, this understanding and fundamental recognition that this is not an environmental problem that has a technical solution. We know that we can't handle climate change unilaterally. We can't also silo it off. And we have all of these lessons, of course, that were really drilled in throughout the pandemic that echoed what climate activists have been saying for years, that we know that intersecting crises exacerbate existing inequalities. One of the things that we're dealing with now, for instance, is what some have dubbed like a crisis of multilateralism. So really trying to understand how our multilateral institutions, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is where parties come together to try and think about these issues at a global level, how these institutions can really prompt real action and in line with country level commitments and country level capacity and country level responsibility, rather than just more unfulfilled promises that have kind of gotten us to this point already. And we know that ultimately, if we want to address climate change, we need climate just solutions that are based in this real system-wide, as Sophie was saying, transformative change. And that's necessary to meet the scale of not only what justice demands, but what the science demands and shows us are the pathways forward. And we know right now that the evidence also shows that a justice-oriented approach, an approach that's really centering human rights and equality, will ultimately be the most effective and the most sustainable and transformative as we're addressing this challenge. So I hope that helps to underscore all of the ways in which the climate crisis intersects with these overarching questions of justice that so many of us were dealing with from a health lens during our fellowships. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Tara, for that. And I hope the audience has really had a great understanding of climate justice. I, for one, I have, because there's so much discussion that just happens around climate change, but not a lot of discussion about who is responsible and how can we work together to ensure this. It's so easy to point fingers at who has done what and who has done what, and not just look at our own environments and see what we have done and what we can do. But you did mention something that was very important. Me coming from a biodiversity and environmental protection point of view, even with our work, it's really hard to get people to care about these conversations if they're not, certain about what they're going to eat next, if they're not guaranteed about, providing school fees for their kids. And you mentioned something about looking at climate justice and all these other aspects as interrelated discussions, and not just looking at climate change as one aspect. And I think that is such an important thing to be mindful of going into these discussions or trying to come up with programs to mitigate climate change. If you have all those, an approach that addresses all these issues at once, then there's more chances of recording impact and You did touch on so many things, which I will break down when we get to a more detailed discussion. But sort of like a follow-up from that, talking about communities and people and the impacts of climate change, comes the aspect of vulnerability. Now, who is most vulnerable to these effects, and how is vulnerability exactly determined? If I could throw it to Sophie and Reuben, if you have any sort of discussions and discussion points from your own work that you've seen that you can bring to the table to the discussion.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think this dovetails really nicely with everything that Tara just mentioned. I think that when we think about vulnerability, it's kind of common for people to just think about your exposure to current climate impacts or future climate risks. And so that encompasses droughts and floods and extreme weather events and sea level rise. And your exposure is definitely part of the formula, but it's only one piece of the equation. I think what we've seen in the latest climate science reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is like the authoritative scientific body on climate change, they brought in an enormous amount of social scientists to think about vulnerability. And what they found after synthesizing thousands of studies is that, I mean, we've long known this, but it's just nice to see it reaffirmed in such a seminal report that vulnerability is also politically, socially, and economically determined. And these political, social, and economic factors can heighten your sensitivity to climate impacts, or they can also limit your capacity to adapt to climate impacts. So if you live in a country that's struggling with conflict, if you live in a highly inequitable country, if you live below the poverty line, if you belong to a marginalized group, all of that, all of those factors influence where you live, what resources you have, whether or not you can cope with climate impacts that are already happening, or whether or not you can adapt to future impacts. So, for example, if you're a community that's living in a low-lying floodplain that's really vulnerable to flooding, can you move to higher ground, or can you retrofit your house so that it's on stilts? If you have money, if you have support from local institutions, you might be able to. If you don't, you're not able to, and so you're more vulnerable to climate change. And I think, one other piece I would add is that many of the world's most vulnerable people live in developing countries. I think the IPCC found that over 3 billion people live in highly vulnerable countries, but vulnerability is also, people are disproportionately vulnerable within those countries too. So low-income communities and communities of color in the United States, for example, are also highly vulnerable to climate change. So I think it's important to think about it both between countries, but also within countries.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Reuben, any additions?
Yeah, I think that has been well covered. And just to add one element is, what was alluded to earlier, there is also the vulnerability in terms of the unborn. So because also climate change is an intergenerational issue. So then it means, with everything that's happening right now with the impacts of climate change, then that puts at risk future generations in terms of, the physical environment that they will inherit. But also secondly, in terms of also, the kind of society and livelihood, and also even the economic impact, because we are going to be accumulating a whole lot of debt in the next couple of years, which will have to be paid by future generations to deal with the impacts of climate change. So I also think there's the intergenerational aspect, and that makes future generations to be very, very, very vulnerable.
Thank you so much, Sophie and Reuben, for that. Reuben mentioned something about, passing climate change effects from this generation to the next. And it sort of reminded me of a quote I read earlier before the session started. And it says, we are the first generation to feel the effects of climate change, and yet we are the last generation that can do something about it. And that sort of really ties in well with what Reuben said. Whatever it is we do now really sets the pace for what is, yet to come. But sort of bringing it back to vulnerability and what some of the panelists have said. Now, women and girls, especially in the global South, are one of the key groups that have been disproportionately affected by the climate change crisis. And I know there's efforts that are being done, to address this inequity that is going within the feminist climate justice issue. But, and this is something that Tara talked about earlier, and very, very excited to delve into this a little deeper. What is feminist climate justice, and what is being done to advocate for it? Now, Tara, I know a lot of your work centers around this, and you did mention a tiny bit of it in your introduction, but if you'd really help us understand this a little further, what feminist climate justice means and what is being done and what it looks like at the moment.
Absolutely. So feminist climate justice means that we're bringing a feminist political analysis into our understanding of climate justice and what climate just solutions look like. And that means recognizing that gender is this inherent dimension in our lives, and that our socially constructed gender roles, wherever you may live, have impacts on your perspectives, on your access to resources, on your access to opportunities, on the types of spaces that you may or may not be welcome in. All of these things that are really fundamental when we think about how we need participatory, inclusive decision-making that promotes equality in order to have the most resilient communities, in order to have communities that are able to adapt to climate change, and that also have the ability to create and implement effective mitigation solutions. So we're not only recognizing the ways in which our historically disproportionate impacts due to the ways in which women and girls most frequently have been structurally disenfranchised and unable to access the same level of resources and opportunities in many places, leaving them sometimes with greater exposure, with greater risk, with greater vulnerabilities in certain areas of their lives, but also recognizing that any solutions moving forward must include and center gender equality, that we can't approach the climate crisis as if it does not affect gender equality. In fact, it often exacerbates inequalities, as I mentioned before, but that also we can't fully address this multifaceted issue that is driven in part by inequalities and power imbalances and power dynamics, without saying that equality is part of the solution. And gender equal societies and communities are going to be better able to rise to meet this challenge. So we want to see holistic, integrated solutions. We want to ensure that when we're talking about women and girls' participation, we're not just talking about their representation sometimes at stakeholder consultation meetings, but true inclusive decision-making and leadership opportunities at all levels. Recognizing that often when we're talking about adaptation, that there is an affinity for talking about women and girls and gender in that space that's often lacking when we're talking about mitigation. And that can be dangerous in and of itself, just thinking that certain activities don't have anything to do with gender. Because when we start to believe that something doesn't affect part of our identities, then we do risk this worsening of it. And a feminist analysis also recognizes, of course, that we're talking about all of our identities, not just our gender, that this is fully intersecting with race, class, ability, geographic location, education, all of these identities that lead to kind of an intersectional feminist understanding of how our current power dynamics have worsened the climate crisis, and rather than recognizing the true opportunity that is posed by centering women's human rights as the key strategy. Thanks.
Oh, wow, thank you so much, Tara, for that. You did mention quite a lot of aspects around, gender equality when it comes to the climate change fight. And as you were talking about that, I just reflected on some of the initiatives that we did in communities around Bwindi, Impenetrable National Park, where you have the community depending heavily on the forest resources to have access to fuel for cooking. And, in those communities, it's mostly the women that will, be using that fuel to be able to provide food for their families. And that taking into that aspect to be able to empower the women in terms of using alternative cooking sources of fuel helped us reduce the pressure on the forest as a source of that. And that was just a key example of what can be done, not just to have the women, and you mentioned this and I was smiling, not just having them attend these meetings, but really empowering them to be able to have actions. And I think that's important, taking these discussions from just talking about stuff to really starting to implement. And that's such an important aspect. And you smoothly led us into a different discussion that I wanted to tap into, which is about climate adaptation, mitigation, loss, and damage. Now, in the Paris Agreement, countries adopted an approach of climate adaptation to minimize the effects of climate change, climate mitigation, to combat the effects of climate change and address loss and damage. Now, I can guarantee you, the folks who are listening in, this is as confusing to you as it is to me. All these aspects really sound the same. I'm just going to invite Sophia and Reuben to help us understand the distinction between climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and addressing loss and damage. And in a very, what's the word I'm looking for? In a way that can be related to your work, what are some of the measures that are being taken under each of these approaches to address issues around climate change and climate justice? Reuben?
Sure, I'm gonna go into that. But also, if you allow me, I just wanted to add one point, which I think is very important to the gender conversation. And thanks so much for laying out the feminist climate justice, spectrum. And I also liked how you use, integrating and centering, genders and identity and other identities at the center of climate action. I really liked the framing of it. One thing I've also come to see from experience working with a lot of insurance companies working on micro insurance product is that there's one very important aspect that women play in society and as far as climate change is concerned, and which is that they are the custodians of local knowledge. And why this is important is because, like Africa, 60% of the population in Africa is smallholder farmers. And that's huge because it means 3 out of 5 people are involved in smallholder farming. And a big proportion of these smallholder farmers are actually women, which means then they know the environment really well as far as production is concerned. From my culture, we say, it's women who knows when to expect the next rains to fall. They know when it's going to be raining next, when to expect harvest and all this. And the reason this point is important is then if you look then at the governance structures within the climate system, all the way from, say, national level, ministries of environment and come to community organizations and all that, women are not the ones leading, the environmental space. So it means, then there's a disconnect, because if all this indigenous local knowledge is then not sitting at the table and decisions and policies are being made up, then it means there's very huge sense of resourcefulness that exists, within society that is not influencing, policy decisions and actions and that kind of thing. I just wanted to mention that. On the question around climate mitigation and adaptation, I think the easiest way to say it is, so we we know that, with the effects of climate change, there is, at least a good number of people have heard about, increase in, greenhouse gas emissions, in the air, and I'm just using, very layman terms, not talking also of atmosphere and all that. And then, of course, increasing temperature levels and all that. So mitigation for me would be any action that reduces the amount of emissions in the atmosphere. So anything that reduces the amount. And then adaptation would be, anything that comes to manage the risks of that impact. So you assume that it has already happened, and what do you actually do about it? So a good example, when people say, oh, let's do sustainable transport, electric cars and these kind of things, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce how much emission goes into the atmosphere. So that's climate mitigation. And then if you say, okay, this risk has already happened, so let's do something about flood protection, let's do, housing upgrades so that, houses are more stable to effects of climate change. So anything that helps, to withstand that particular shock that has already happened or is due to happen, then that's, climate adaptation. So from the word, it's how do you actually adapt to the impacts or the outcomes of climate change. And of course, loss and damage is saying, okay, given that, what we could have reduced to be introduced, and, mitigation is behind us, and where we would have adapted, there was no enough adaptation happening. And so the actual loss has already happened. So that's what we call loss and damage. So what is the extent of loss? This loss could be in terms of actually, living life. So it could be in terms of deaths and sicknesses and all these health related issues, but also it could be damage in terms of like physical effects. So if you think about displacements, houses that go with, mudslides and stuff like that. So the loss and damage is the actual effect that has been experienced. And of course, a lot of times it's usually quantified. So you'll say, this number of deaths from, say, the cyclone Idai in Mozambique, and this number of loss, a $3 billion loss from that particular thing. So that's how I would try to differentiate mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage.
Thank you so much, Reuben. Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, Reuben's given you a fantastic overview of these three topics. Because I work on climate change across agriculture and land systems, I would add that when we think about mitigation, it is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's also about avoiding future greenhouse gas emissions by halting deforestation. And then it's also about removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And you can do that through technologies, although those are really nascent. There are lots of trade-offs. We're still kind of, the climate community is a little bit torn on what the role of carbon removal technology should be. But there's also an option of planting trees or restoring coastal wetlands, which also can enhance ecosystems' ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And the kind of scary thing is that the latest science is that we actually need both. We need to dramatically reduce emissions, we need to avoid emissions, and we need to scale up removing carbon from the atmosphere pretty quickly. So I would add that piece to the mitigation conversation. I would also note that for some systems, these adaptation and mitigation represent very different strategies, but in some systems, they can actually be one and the same. So think like what I was just talking about, like restoring coastal wetlands, for example, that these ecosystems sequester more carbon, they store more carbon in their soils per hectare than almost any ecosystem on the planet. But they also have an enormous amount of benefits for adaptation. They can protect coastal communities from storm surges. They can actually do this really cool thing where they can build up soil so they can protect coastal communities from sea level rise. They can also offer coastal communities like a whole host of other biodiversity and food security benefits. So I think it's also really important to think about strategies that can do both, particularly given how limited climate finance is at the moment. And then the only other point that I would add to what Reuben said on loss and damage is that sadly, loss and damage can also be non-economic and be cultural. And I think that's a really difficult thing to quantify. I mean, you can't really quantify it. And so sometimes it gets missed in these conversations, but it's so important. And it's not just like the loss of countries, but it's also the loss of cultural sites. So we're already losing our history. And if we don't take rapid actions, like in the next decade, we're going to lose so much more of it. And that's just a really upsetting thing, I think, to think about.
Wow. Thank you so much, Reuben and Sophie, for that. To the participants who are listening in, don't forget to add your questions in the chat box if you have any from the discussions that we've had so far. But also there's links to some of these discussions that we've had for you to be able to, read more and understand more about some of the issues that the panelists are touching in a very elaborate way. So feel free to check out the message in the chat box for you to be able to access these resources. Now, a lot of things that the panelists have been touching on have been centered around, strategies. So we talked about adaptation strategies, and all these initiatives sort of, need, resources, whether it's money or, human capital. And it sort of brings me back to the discussion that I've really been looking forward to having around climate finance. Now, there's insufficient financial support and action towards climate change mitigation and adaptation to respond to the climate emergency and increasing climate-related loss and damage. And vulnerable developing countries are often the most affected, by the insufficient financial support to address some of these climate change impacts, whether resources are being delayed and given in form of loans. Sort of wanted me to brings me to the next question. Who is responsible for offering financial support to vulnerable countries? And if you're talking about financial support, what financial support mechanisms are in place or should be in place to support vulnerable communities to sort of help them recover from climate-related loss and damage? Reuben, I know this is your topic of interest. You wanted to start us off?
Yeah, it's all our topic. I think the truth is that the question of who gets to pay for effects of climate change, I think is one of the topics everybody loves to dance around, with a common theme of people avoiding to take responsibility. Since we're talking about climate justice, there's one, for lawyers in the room, I'm an economist. One of the key tenets of international law and also international humanitarian law is around, polluter pays principle, which means you actually pay up for what you pollute. And we had hoped for a very long time that actually gets to work. So, nations and that have accounted for the highest impact of, emissions actually get to pay up for that. And looking back at the Paris Agreement in 2015, the advanced or developed nations committed to channel $100 billion every year. By 2020 to have gotten there, that every year they channel $100 billion to developing nations. And as per, the last metric, which was tracked, I think was around 2018, 2019, we are still, it's still way below $100 billion. So to your question, who pays? Then there's sort of a natural, I'll even call it natural justice. I don't think this is even in the realms of law. There's like a natural justice understanding that, countries that have contributed to the highest portions of greenhouse gas emissions end up paying more for those levels of emissions. But said that, there are different categories of where funding comes from. A lot of the work I've seen in terms of profiling finance flows for climate finance is either you're looking at the public or private sector. So public is probably what governments are funding, and how much is going to, from governments and other public institutions, and of course private fundings. And within a national level, how much of this finance is domestic and how much is coming from foreign sources. There's a very interesting report, which I won't go into the details, but there's a very interesting report. I think it's called Innovative Finance. It's by Global Center on Adaptation. But what they simply did, they actually tracked how much climate adaptation finance has gone to Africa and seeing where is it coming from. And what is crazy is that, like a lot of the finance, of course, very underfunded, because they said until 2030, over a period of just short of 10 years from late last year, there was a funding up of around 330 billion, which was translating to around $33 to $35 billion a year. But only $6 billion was being tracked annually in Africa, with around 80% of it coming from concessional finance and grants, which means there isn't very much private financing that is actually coming to deal with the issues of climate finance. But also what is even more interesting is that a lot of this finance was also coming externally from bilateral partners and from like international organizations, which means also like within the countries, either countries one lack the capacity to finance the effects of climate change within their borders, or probably it's just not prioritized in terms of like fiscal budgeting at the national level. So that is just a landscape of what the climate finance looks like. And just so and just to make a final point, because now the topic today is about climate justice, I have to mention this. One of the things that actually exacerbates inequality, as has been mentioned, is the fact that because a lot of the financing is coming in terms of loans, especially for disaster financing, then it's really setting countries back. I mean, when Mozambique was hit by the cyclone a few years ago, they ended up borrowing at least 13% of like their response to the cyclone was in terms of loans. And that by itself, given it's like, not a high income country, made their borrowing as a percentage of GDP to go to like 110 plus. So it also shows you, depending on what instruments people use to respond to the effects of climate change, that can actually end up making them worse off in terms of the effects, as we've said, loss and damage, but also in terms of they're getting the financing, because they don't have access to non-commercial sources of funds. And so they end up using a lot of loans to respond to disasters such as cyclones. So I'll stop talking, but that's in an overall how I would like to look into issues of climate finance, and also really trying to keep it very simple. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reuben. That was very, very insightful. Tara, any submissions?
Yeah, thank you so much for that framing. I know also it can be scary whenever we hear the words climate finance, because people inherently think finance, I don't know anything about finance, but this is actually critical because climate finance underpins all the climate action that we need. And it's also important to note that it is an obligation under the UNFCCC for developed countries to give climate finance to developing countries because of this principle of polluter pays, of common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing the historical emissions. There are so many different calculations on what a fair share would be for different countries to contribute overall to climate finance, but I can recognize that living in the US, we have been responsible historically for by some calculations, 40% of historical emissions in the world, and we remain the wealthiest country on earth. And I've been part of a civil society initiative saying that because of that, not only does the US need to reduce its emissions entirely to zero, it needs to pay the equivalent to other countries to enable just as much mitigation in those other countries as achieving within its own country. When we're also talking about climate finance, though, it's important to think about how we're paying this money and the institutions through which we are doing this. So we want to think about moving money through transparent institutions, democratic institutions. For example, the Green Climate Fund compared to the World Bank, because in the Green Climate Fund, there's equal board seats allocated to developed and developing countries compared to the World Bank, where the amount of your donations determines the size of your voting power. And this issue that grants and loans that Reuben is bringing up is always central. But when we're also thinking about this feminist lens that we want to apply, it's particularly critical that there is access to grant-based finance, not loan-based finance, for community organizations, for women-led organizations, for these organizations that are at the grassroots, that have these integrated understandings, that have this traditional and local and indigenous knowledge that should be deployed and that's central to the types of solutions we want to see. And it's also just not enough to have a bigger pot of money if we're not channeling the money to the right solutions. So when we're thinking about the feminist solutions and increasing the amount of money going into adaptation, because it's so much less than what's going into mitigation right now, we also want to think about investing in restoration rather than investing in infrastructure, and really appreciate the points that Sophie was bringing up. When we are not only protecting and restoring environmental landscapes such as coastal wetlands, but by ensuring the human rights and protecting the land tenure rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities is one of the best ways to ensure the continued carbon sequestration in these landscapes. And we want to ensure that, again, we are approaching this as an integrated problem. So for example, I'm part of a newer coalition that's the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights and Climate Justice Coalition, where we're pointing out how important it is to strengthen our health systems and make investments in SRHR, because those are some of the first services that we know that are cut in times of climate disaster. That our key adaptation strategy is, of course, to continue to ensure that we have access to a full range of sexual and reproductive healthcare services. And so these are the questions that arise with climate finance, of how the money is structured, where it's going, who it's flowing to, and what it's ultimately funding, that make all of this so complicated as we also are contemplating the incredible urgency before us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that. And thank you for breaking down the whole aspects around climate justice. I think, sorry, climate finance. I think that's a very much needed conversation, especially right now that, we have issue after issue and everybody's asking for funding. Where does the money go to, and which initiatives do you actually go to? You don't want just fund projects. You want to fund projects that are really going to record the highest level of impact, but also efforts that can easily be adopted by some of these communities that are having the biggest effects of climate change. I think that's a very important discussion to bring to the table. I'm trying to check the chat and the Q&A section if we have any questions from the audience. Like I said, if you have any questions that you'd like to address to any of the panelists, feel free to drop it down in the chat box. And as we wait for any questions to pop up, I'm just going to drop it back to the panelists. And if I could start with you, Sophie, from an individual level, what is our role as individuals in the fight towards climate justice, and what can we do to demand greater change? I know there's a lot of conversations we've had about different organizations and what you are all doing at individual and your organization's level to be able to create the change that you're witnessing. And thank you all for the amazing work that you do. But for everyone listening, what can we do as individuals at our own levels to fight towards climate justice? So if I could start with you, Sophie, and then Tara and Reuben.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I often struggle with because I think that individual change is really important, and it's going to take all of us thinking about these topics and integrating them into our work to really start to see that change add up. But at the same time, I also feel like I've talked a lot about these big systems, and I think that a lot of people's choices based on their place in society can be really constrained by these systems at play. So it's really difficult for me to actually answer that question. I mean, I think that if you live in the United States or in a wealthier country, looking at we all overconsume, and we all, take far more than our fair share of the remaining carbon budget that we have left. So if you live in the US or in Western Europe, I would really urge you to consider rethinking your consumption across like what you're eating, how much you're flying, and I'm happy to share those kinds of resources. But if I think you're working kind of in communities and in global health, which I imagine lots of people on this call are, I would really urge you to think about how climate change is affecting the communities that you're working with, and how climate change might impact your own organization's operations, so that you can be prepared to address the kind of changing health landscape of your community, but also ensure that you can continue to deliver services when climate impacts start intensifying. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but I hope it's at least helpful, and I'm happy to provide additional resources.
Thank you so much, Sophie. No, that was really helpful. It was, especially when you brought it back to consumption. Even just eating habits can go a long way into helping you reduce waste at an individual level. So I think that was spot on. Tara?
Absolutely. I saw a new report that just came out very recently, I believe, that cutting our meat consumption by 20% can reduce deforestation by 50%, which is incredible. But I would say the thing that we all have to do, and we all have within our ability, is our political participation, starting with voting and then moving into whatever ways that you have to engage in political processes, whether that's locally, nationally, or internationally, and to really hold our political leaders accountable to creating policies and then actually following through on those pledges and those commitments to create a livable and just and equitable future for us all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tara. Reuben?
Yeah, a lot of important things have been said, and Sarah mentioned about political participation. I'm currently working out of Nairobi, and Kenya has upcoming elections in August, national elections. And it has actually made me think, I haven't seen the green agenda on any of the coalitions, campaign discussion. I probably need to go looking for that so that I don't say there isn't, and probably there is, but I haven't had it been very outspoken on that. But in terms of individual contribution, I'll say what I'm doing. I think for me is, being at this intersection, I find a lot of climate organizations or people running projects, grassroots projects, and looking for funding. And also there's a lot of calls for applications for people to apply for opportunities for funding. So currently I'm running a platform called Net Zero Africa, netzeroafrica.org. Currently it's a beta version. and where we'll just be, curating opportunities on climate funding, and organizations looking for climate funding can come and see those opportunities already curated, so they just don't have to go, just Google searching. They can go to an actual database, and it will be the go-to platform for climate funding opportunities in Africa. Secondly, which I always urge everyone who asks me, oh, how did you get into the climate space? What can I do? I always urge everyone to get interested in the science, because I think there's a lot of big talk about like climate change. I mean, it sounds very fancy and also, sexy, if I would call it that. And all these big conferences, Glasgow this year, it's going to be in Egypt, COP27, Geneva, Davos, all these things, and people don't really get interested in the science. So I always urge people to understand the science. It's as basic as understanding, okay, what does UV rays from the sun have to do with climate change? Understanding, okay, what does me eating meat have to do with rising sea levels and deforestation? Just getting interested in the science of it. Because I think if we can elevate the average level of knowledge of how much people understand about climate change and how it works, then what we will end up doing is elevating the level of consciousness. And then, which means then the actions people take, either at individual level or in positions of leadership that they actually occupy, then we are going to have some great